You can tell a system is about to fail by the way it starts whispering before it breaks. Marcus Hale didn't say it out loud this time. He just stood there, still as the hum of the building settled into his bones, one hand resting lightly against the edge of a control panel that wasn't even part of his job. The hallway was empty at this hour, long past the rush of polished shoes and sharp voices, long past the echo of meetings that decided things men like him were never asked about. The lights overhead flickered once, barely noticeable. Most people would have missed it. Most people did. But Marcus tilted his head, eyes narrowing just slightly, not with alarm, but with recognition. He had seen that kind of flicker before, not just in wires or circuits, but in patterns, in systems, in people. Something small, something out of rhythm. He didn't move right away, didn't rush, didn't call anyone. He simply watched, listening past the surface noise, past the steady mechanical breathing of the building, until he caught it again. A delay, less than a second. A hesitation in the system's response that shouldn't have been there. He exhaled slowly. No one noticed. No one ever did at this stage. That was how things like this worked. Problems didn't arrive like storms. They crept in quiet. He set his toolbox down without a sound and crouched slightly, glancing at the panel readout. Numbers rolled past in neat, obedient lines, but there it was again, a stutter buried deep where no one bothered to look twice. Marcus reached out, fingers hovering for just a moment before making contact, as if asking permission from something unseen. He wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't his department, not his responsibility. That was clear from the badge clipped to his shirt, the one that told everyone exactly how far his voice was allowed to go. But responsibility had never been the same thing as awareness. And awareness didn't wait for permission. He adjusted a single setting. Small, precise, the kind of change that wouldn't trigger alerts or emails or meetings. Just a quiet correction, like straightening a picture frame no one realized was crooked. The system responded instantly. Smoother, cleaner. The stutter disappeared. For now, Marcus didn't smile, didn't linger. He wiped his hands on the worn cloth tucked into his back pocket, then stood, eyes drifting once more across the panel as if committing the moment to memory. Something deeper was wrong. He could feel it. Not fixed, just delayed. He picked up his toolbox and stepped away, his boots making almost no sound against the polished floor. Behind him, the lights held steady again, the building continuing its perfect illusion of control. Upstairs, decisions were still being made. Phones still rang. Deals still moved forward like nothing had changed. But Marcus paused at the end of the hallway, just for a second, glancing back at the panel he wasn't supposed to touch. Not yet, he murmured under his breath, voice calm, almost gentle. Then he turned and walked on, disappearing into the quiet like he had never been there at all. Up on the 32nd floor, the air felt different, thinner somehow, as if even the oxygen had learned to move with purpose. Evelyn Carter stood at the head of a long glass table, one hand resting lightly on the back of a chair she had not sat in for the past 40 minutes. Her phone vibrated again against the polished surface. She did not pick it up. Not yet. Run that projection again, she said, her voice calm, precise, cutting through the room without needing to rise. Around her, a dozen executives shifted in their seats, fingers tapping tablets, screens flickering with charts that looked confident at first glance and uncertain if you stared long enough. The numbers moved, recalculated, adjusted. Something was off. No one said it directly. They never did at this level. Instead, they spoke in softened language. Slight variance. Minor delay. Temporary inefficiency. Words designed to keep panic from taking shape. Evelyn's gaze moved from one face to another, reading what they would not say out loud. She had built her reputation on seeing what others missed, on catching the fractures before they became headlines. But today, the room felt slower. Not incompetent, just delayed, like a heartbeat arriving half a second too late. Why is the system lagging on? Real-time updates? She asked, finally picking up her phone, glancing at a message that had come through 3 minutes ago and already felt too old. A man near the end of the table cleared his throat. It is within acceptable range, he said carefully. We are still operating at full capacity. Evelyn did not respond immediately. She walked to the window instead, heels quiet against the floor, the city stretching below in perfect lines and controlled motion. Everything looked stable from up here. It always did. She had learned a long time ago that stability was often just a well-maintained illusion. Behind her, the room waited. No one checked their watch. No one spoke out of turn. Power had its own gravity, and right now it was centered on her silence. Acceptable is not the same as correct, she said finally, without turning around. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass. Composed, sharp, unreadable, exactly what they expected. But there was a faint crease between her brows that had not been there yesterday. I want diagnostics pulled from every subsystem, she continued. Not summaries. Raw data. A few heads nodded quickly. Fingers moved faster now. Instructions repeated, messages sent. The machine responded, just like it always did when pressure was applied from the top. But even as the room accelerated, something in Evelyn's chest remained still. Unsettled. She turned back toward the table, eyes narrowing slightly as another screen refreshed. There it was again. A flicker. Not in the lights. In the numbers. Small. Easy to dismiss. Impossible to ignore once seen. Who flagged this earlier? She asked. Silence answered her. Not defensive. Just blank. Because no one had. Or if they had, it had not reached this room. Evelyn studied the data for another second, then placed her phone face down on the table. The vibration continued underneath her hand, muted now, persistent. Find it, she said quietly. Not a command shouted across the room. Something steadier. More dangerous. Because it meant she had already decided it mattered. And somewhere far below, in a quiet hallway no one on this floor would ever walk, a system that had almost stumbled once was beginning to hesitate again. Marcus stepped out into the evening air with the same quiet rhythm he carried through every part of his day. The city already settling into that low, steady hum that came after business hours, when the people who made decisions went home and the people who kept things running stayed behind. His truck sat in the far corner of the parking lot, older than most of the cars around it, a little worn, a little tired, but dependable in the way that mattered. He opened the door, set his toolbox on the passenger seat, and paused for just a second before turning the key, his eyes drifting back toward the building. 32 floors of glass and light. From the outside, it looked perfect. It always did. He started the engine and pulled out slowly, merging into traffic that moved like a living thing, predictable on the surface, chaotic underneath. By the time he reached home, the sky had turned a deep blue, streetlights flickering on one by one like quiet signals passed between strangers. His apartment sat above a small grocery store, the kind of place that still had handwritten signs in the window and a bell that rang when you walked in. Inside, the air smelled faintly of detergent and something warm cooking from a neighboring unit. Dad? A small voice called from the living room. Marcus stepped in, setting his keys down by the door. I am home, he replied, his voice softer now, the weight of the day shifting without needing to be spoken. His son, Caleb, sat cross-legged on the floor with a half-built science kit spread out in front of him, wires and small plastic pieces scattered in careful chaos. It is not working, Caleb said, holding up a piece that blinked once and then went dark. Marcus crouched beside him, resting one arm on his knee, studying the small device the way he had studied the panel earlier. Not rushing, not assuming, just watching. Show me what it is supposed to do, he said. Caleb explained, words tumbling over each other, hands moving faster than his thoughts. Marcus nodded once, then gently adjusted a single connection, pressing it in just enough to make contact. The light came on. Steady this time. Caleb's face lit up, brighter than the device in his hands. You fixed it, he said. Marcus gave a small shake of his head. It just needed to be connected the right way, he replied. He stood, moving toward the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, but still served its purpose. From the living room, Caleb's voice continued, narrating his project to no one in particular, confident now, certain. Marcus leaned against the counter, eyes unfocused for a moment, replaying the flicker he had seen earlier, the hesitation in the system that did not belong there. It had been small, too small for most people to notice, but not random, never random. He took a slow sip, then set the cup down untouched. Something was building, not broken yet, just misaligned, like Caleb's circuit before it failed. He walked to the small table by the window, pulling out a worn notebook, flipping to a blank page. No company logo, no official format, just his handwriting, steady and deliberate as he sketched out what he had seen, piece by piece, connection by connection, building a picture no one had asked him to create. Outside, a siren passed in the distance, fading quickly into the night. Inside, Marcus kept writing, the quiet filling the room like something alive, something patient. He did not know when the system would fail, but he knew it would. And when it did, it would not be loud at first. It would start the same way it always did, with a whisper no one else could hear. The next morning arrived without warning, the kind of quiet transition that made everything feel normal until it was not. Marcus stood in the same hallway as the day before, the same panel in front of him, the same low hum running through the walls like a steady heartbeat. But this time, he did not need to wait for it. The hesitation was already there. Not hidden anymore. Not subtle. The numbers on the display moved faster than before, but not cleaner. There was a drag now, a resistance buried underneath the surface, like something trying to keep up and failing by inches. Marcus exhaled slowly, setting his toolbox down again, his eyes scanning the readout with the same calm focus he had used at his kitchen table the night before. He did not touch anything yet. Not this time. He just watched. Above him, 32 floors up, the shift was already being felt. Evelyn stood in front of a wall of screens, her posture unchanged, but the room around her had lost its earlier composure. Voices were lower now, tighter, no longer wrapped in polished language. "We are seeing delays across multiple systems," someone said. "Processing time has doubled in the last hour." Another voice followed, faster. "Data sync is lagging between departments. Reports are coming in out of order." Evelyn did not interrupt. She stepped closer to the screens, eyes moving across the data with precision, tracing patterns that refused to line up the way they should. "This is not a surface issue," she said quietly. "Something underneath is misfiring." No one disagreed. They just did not know where to look. Back downstairs, Marcus crouched slightly, pulling a small notebook from his pocket, flipping it open to the page he had written the night before. The lines matched. Not perfectly, but close enough. He glanced back at the panel, then at the notes, then back again. It was happening faster than he expected. He reached up, pressing one button to bring up a deeper layer of data, the kind that required more than a passing glance to understand. The screen shifted. For a moment, everything looked fine. Then it stuttered again. There it was. A recursive delay, stacking on itself, small at first, but growing each time the system cycled through. Marcus nodded once, more to himself than anything else. Upstairs, Evelyn's phone vibrated again. This time she picked it up. A message from a senior client. "We are experiencing delays on our end. Is everything stable?" She stared at the words for a second longer than necessary, then set the phone down without responding. Not yet. She would not answer until she understood. "Pull the core architecture logs," she said, her voice sharper now, not louder, just more exact. "I want to see where the lag originates." A technician hesitated. That could take time. Evelyn turned her head slightly, her gaze enough to end the hesitation. "Then start now." Downstairs, Marcus stood, wiping his hands slowly, his eyes still on the panel. The system corrected itself for a moment, smoothing out just enough to look stable again. But he knew better. This was not recovery. It was strain. He picked up his toolbox, then paused, his hand resting on the handle as he looked at the screen one more time. No alarms had gone off. No alerts had been sent his way. To the system, he did not exist. But the problem did. And it was getting louder. Not in sound. In pattern. In repetition. In the way the same mistake kept trying to hide itself and failing just a little more each time. Marcus turned and walked down the hallway, his pace steady, his expression unchanged. Above him, the building moved faster, tighter, closer to something no one had fully named yet. And somewhere between the silence and the noise, the crisis had already begun. By mid-afternoon, the building had changed in ways that could not be explained by numbers alone. The air felt tighter, conversations shorter, footsteps faster but less certain, like everyone was moving with urgency, but without direction. Marcus noticed at the moment he stepped back into the lower corridor, the hum of the system no longer steady but layered, uneven, carrying a faint tension that had not been there before. He set his toolbox down near the panel again, but this time he did not open it. He did not need tools for what he was about to do. He needed time, and time was exactly what the system was running out of. Upstairs, Evelyn stood with her arms crossed, watching lines of raw data scroll across a large central screen, no longer filtered, no longer softened into something presentable. It was messy now. Real. There, she said suddenly, stepping closer, pointing at a cluster of repeating cycles. That loop. Why is it stacking? No one answered immediately. Fingers moved. Eyes scanned. One engineer leaned forward. It should not be, he said quietly. That pathway is supposed to reset after each cycle. Evelyn's gaze sharpened. But it is not. The room fell silent again, this time heavier. Because now it was no longer a question of delay. It was a question of failure in motion. Downstairs, Marcus had already found it. He stood in front of the panel, one hand resting lightly against the side, his eyes focused not just on the screen, but on the pattern behind it, the same pattern he had traced in his notebook the night before. The recursive loop was deeper than it looked. It was feeding itself, small inefficiencies building into larger ones, stacking delay on delay until the system could no longer keep up with its own demand. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 3:42 p.m. peak load hours were still ahead. If it continued like this, the system would not crash all at once. It would slow, then stall, then fracture in pieces no one could reconnect in time. Marcus exhaled slowly, his hand hovering over the panel again. He could adjust it. Maybe. But not from here. Not with the access he had. This was not a surface fix anymore. This was structural. Upstairs, Evelyn's phone buzzed again. This time, she answered. Carter, she said, her voice even. A pause. Then her jaw tightened just slightly. We are aware of the delay, she continued. No, it is not affecting final output yet. Another pause. I will call you back. She ended the call and looked up at the room. We do not have time for guesses, she said. Find the origin of the loop. Now. But the system did not care about urgency. It followed its own logic. Downstairs, Marcus stepped back from the panel, picking up his toolbox, then setting it down again almost immediately, like he had changed his mind mid-motion. He looked down the empty hallway, then back at the panel, then down again. No one was coming. No one was looking here. Not yet. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his badge, turning it over in his fingers, as if measuring its weight against something else. Access was limited, but not zero, and sometimes limited was enough. He slid the badge across the reader. The panel responded with a soft click, granting him a deeper layer than before. Not full control, but closer. He leaned in slightly, eyes scanning faster now, connecting pieces, tracing pathways the system itself was too rigid to question. All right, he murmured under his breath, not to the machine, not to anyone else, just to the moment. Then he placed his hand on the interface, steady, precise, and began to move through the structure no one upstairs had found yet, the quiet hum around him shifting as if the building itself was holding its breath. The deeper layer did not look different at first. That was the problem. It was clean, structured, efficient on the surface, just like everything else in the building. But Marcus did not trust surfaces. He moved slowly through the interface, not clicking at random, not forcing anything open, just following the logic the way he would follow a quiet conversation, listening for what did not belong. The loop revealed itself in fragments. A delay here. A duplicated call there. Small enough to ignore if you only looked once. But Marcus never looked once. He traced the path backward, one connection at a time, until the pattern stopped repeating and started originating. That was where the system hesitated the most, not because it was broken, but because it was trying to do too much at once. He leaned in slightly, eyes narrowing, reading the sequence like a sentence that had been written incorrectly, but still made sense if you knew what it was trying to say. You are stacking your own weight, he murmured quietly, fingers hovering just above the interface. Upstairs, the tension had shifted from confusion to pressure. Evelyn stood at the center of it, her posture unchanged, but the room around her was moving faster now, voices overlapping, data refreshing in bursts instead of steady flow. We cannot isolate the origin, someone said, frustration bleeding through the careful tone. The loop is embedded across multiple pathways. Evelyn did not respond immediately. She watched the screen, her eyes catching something small, something subtle, a micro-adjustment in one of the data streams that did not match the rest. Stop, she said suddenly. The room froze. Run that segment again. The data replayed. There. A brief stabilization. Less than a second. Then the delay returned. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. Something just corrected itself, she said. Find it. Downstairs, Marcus had already moved past observation. He knew where the pressure point was now, where the system's design had allowed the loop to grow unchecked. Not a flaw, a blind spot. He adjusted a parameter, small enough to avoid triggering system-wide alerts, but precise enough to interrupt the recursive build. The screen responded instantly, the cycle slowing, not stopping, but loosening its grip on itself. Marcus did not stop there. He opened a secondary pathway, rerouting a portion of the load away from the stressed loop, giving it space to reset the way it had originally been designed to do. It was not a permanent fix. Not yet. But it was enough to change the trajectory. Upstairs, the effect was immediate, though no one could explain it. The delay just dropped. A technician said, confusion replacing panic. Processing time is stabilizing. Another voice followed. Data sync is realigning. Evelyn did not relax. Not yet. She stepped closer to the screen, watching the numbers settle, not perfectly, but better. What changed, she asked. Silence answered her again. Because no one in that room had touched the system at that level. Downstairs, Marcus stepped back slightly, his hand resting against the edge of the panel, feeling the shift not just on the screen, but in the hum around him. It was smoother now, still strained, but no longer compounding. He exhaled quietly, not in relief, but in acknowledgement. The crisis had not been stopped. It had been delayed, redirected, given time. He reached forward one last time, documenting the changes in a way that would not draw attention, just enough for the system to hold its new balance. Then he removed his badge, letting it hang back against his chest, the panel returning to its standard interface as if nothing had happened. Upstairs, Evelyn's gaze lingered on the stabilized data, her expression unreadable, but her instincts awake now in a different way. Something had intervened. Quietly. Precisely. Without announcement. She looked around the room, at the people who should have known, who should have acted, and saw only confusion where there should have been ownership. Downstairs, Marcus picked up his toolbox, his movements calm, unhurried, like any other part of his day. The hallway was still empty. The lights. Steady. The system breathing again, just enough to keep going. He turned and walked away without looking back, leaving behind no signature, no credit, only a subtle shift in a machine that would never know his name, and a problem that would not have been solved in time, without hands no one thought to notice. By early evening, the building had returned to something that looked like control, the kind of stability that allowed people to breathe again without realizing they had been holding their breath all day. Screens no longer flashed with irregular spikes, voices softened back into measured tones, and the language shifted once more from urgency to explanation. Upstairs, Evelyn stood at the same glass table, listening as her team reconstructed what they believed had happened. It appears the system recalibrated under load, one executive said, scrolling through a clean report that now looked far more confident than it had just hours before. A temporary loop formed, but it corrected itself before any major disruption. Evelyn did not interrupt. She let the words settle in the room, watched the quiet relief spread across faces that had been tight with tension not long ago. So we are calling it a self-correction, she asked finally, her voice even, almost neutral. Based on the data we have, yes, the man replied. There is no evidence of manual intervention. No evidence. The phrase lingered longer than it should have. Evelyn's eyes moved back to the screen, to the exact moment where the system had shifted, where the delay had loosened its grip just enough to avoid escalation. It had not felt like chance. It had felt deliberate. But the logs were clean. Too clean. Downstairs, Marcus was already finishing his shift, wiping down his tools with slow, practiced movements. Each one returned to its place without thought, like a routine he had carried for years. The hallway behind him was quiet again, untouched by the tension that had passed through it earlier. If someone walked through now, they would never know anything had almost gone wrong. That was how these places worked. Problems were invisible until they were not, and when they were avoided, they disappeared. Completely, leaving no story behind. Marcus closed his toolbox and stood, rolling his shoulders slightly, the fatigue settling in not from effort, but from attention, from holding a line no one else could see. He glanced once toward the panel at the end of the hallway. It looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Still, obedient, quiet. Upstairs, the meeting began to dissolve, people gathering their things, conversations shifting to follow-up emails and adjusted timelines. The crisis had been contained. That was enough for most of them. Evelyn remained where she was, her hand resting lightly against the table, her gaze still fixed on the data that no longer demanded attention but refused to release it. "Send me the raw logs from the last 6 hours," she said without looking up. A few heads turned back. "We already compiled the report," someone offered. "I do not want the report," Evelyn replied. "I want what came before it." The room quieted again, not with urgency this time, but with curiosity. She rarely asked twice. Downstairs, Marcus lifted his toolbox and headed toward the exit, his steps unhurried, blending into the rhythm of a building winding down. Outside, the air had cooled, the sky dimming into evening, the city shifting into its next phase without pause. He reached his truck, set the toolbox inside, and sat for a moment before starting the engine, his hands resting lightly on the wheel, his mind already moving past the day, past the system, past the quiet correction no one would ever trace back to him. Upstairs, Evelyn watched as a new set of raw data loaded onto her screen, unfiltered, unpolished, the way truth usually arrived before it was shaped into something easier to accept. She leaned in slightly, eyes narrowing as she scrolled back to the moment everything had changed, searching not for failure this time, but for intention. Because something had stepped in, and whatever it was, it had not left a name. Only a trace just subtle enough to be missed by anyone who was not looking closely enough to see it. The building was quieter than usual when Evelyn returned to her office that night, long after most of the lights on other floors had dimmed into scattered pockets of overtime and obligation. The city outside stretched in muted gold and blue, distant traffic moving like a slow current, indifferent to whatever had almost happened inside these walls. She stood by the window for a moment, not looking at the skyline, but at her own reflection layered faintly over it, her posture still composed, still controlled, but her eyes sharper now, searching inward as much as outward. On her desk, the raw logs remained open, lines of data scrolling back in time as she traced the moment again and again, not for what failed, but for what intervened. It was subtle, almost respectful, a correction that did not announce itself, did not disrupt the structure more than necessary, just enough to release pressure where it had been building. She leaned forward slightly, her fingers resting against the edge of the desk, her gaze locking onto a sequence she had missed before. A minor access point. Limited clearance. Not executive. Not engineering. Something lower. Someone lower. But precise. Too precise to be accidental. Evelyn exhaled quietly, not in frustration, but in recognition. Whoever had done this had not tried to prove anything. They had not escalated. They had not claimed ownership. They had simply corrected it. Her phone sat untouched beside her, silent now, the urgency of the day replaced by something far less familiar. Curiosity, not about the system, about the person behind the absence of noise. She turned away from the window and walked back to her desk, scrolling further, following the trace backward until it ended not in a name, but in a location. Lower-level access corridor. Maintenance channel. She paused there, her hand still on the mouse, the realization settling slowly, not as a conclusion, but as a shift in perspective. Downstairs, hours earlier, Marcus had already left, the hallway empty, the panel unchanged, the quiet restored so completely it erased the tension that had once filled the space. There was no sign he had ever stood there. No record that would call attention. Only the absence of failure. Evelyn straightened slightly, her posture adjusting in a way no one else would have noticed. A small recalibration not of authority, but of awareness. She had spent years learning to read markets, strategies, people who spoke loudly and moved quickly. But this was different. This was someone who had acted without being seen, solved without being asked, and left without waiting to be acknowledged. She glanced once more at the data, then closed the screen, not because she had found everything, but because she had found enough. Tomorrow, the building would return to its routine. Meetings would resume. Reports would be finalized. The narrative would settle into something acceptable. But for the first time in a long time, Evelyn was not interested in the narrative. She was interested in the silence behind it. Somewhere in this building, someone had chosen to step in when they did not have to. Not for credit. Not for recognition. Just because it needed to be done. She reached for her coat, pausing only briefly before turning off the light, the office falling into shadow except for the faint glow of the city beyond. As she walked out, her steps slower than usual, more deliberate. Something within her had shifted, not in status, not in control, but in the way she now understood the people she had never really looked at before. And somewhere beyond the glass and steel, in a small apartment above a quiet street, Marcus sat at a kitchen table with his son, listening to a story about a simple project that now worked, his attention fully there, unaware that the quiet decision he had made hours earlier had already begun to change something far beyond the system he had touched. The next morning, the building opened like it always did, glass doors sliding back to welcome a steady stream of footsteps, conversations, and expectations that had no memory of what had almost unraveled the day before. Everything looked the same. That was the point. Systems that survived rarely told the story of how close they came to failing. Marcus walked in with the same quiet pace, badge clipped to his shirt, toolbox in hand, blending into the rhythm of a place that did not need to notice him to function. Or so it believed. He passed through the lower corridor, eyes moving once toward the panel without stopping, just enough to confirm what he already knew. The system held. Not perfect, but stable. For now. He kept walking. Upstairs, Evelyn stood by the window again, earlier than usual, a cup of coffee untouched on her desk, her attention already anchored somewhere deeper than schedules or meetings. The raw logs from the night before were still open, not because she needed to review them again, but because she was not finished understanding them. She had traced the correction as far as it would go. It ended in a place no one had considered important. That was what stayed with her. Not the fix itself. The fact that it came from somewhere overlooked. She turned as a soft knock sounded at her door. "Come in," she said. An assistant stepped in, tablet in hand. "Your 9 o'clock is ready," she said. Evelyn nodded once, then paused. "Before that," she added, her voice measured, "I want a list of everyone with access to lower-level maintenance channels. Not filtered. Everyone." The assistant hesitated, surprised more than anything. "That could be a long list," she said carefully. "Then bring me the whole list," Evelyn replied. "No edge. Just clarity." Downstairs, Marcus had already started his routine, moving through tasks that required attention but not recognition, adjusting small things before they became problems, keeping systems aligned in ways that never appeared on reports. He worked the way he always did. Quietly. Fully present. Without expectation. At mid-morning, he paused near the same panel, not to fix anything, but to listen, the hum now even, the tension gone, replaced by something almost balanced. He nodded once, then moved on. Upstairs, Evelyn sat at the head of her meeting, listening as updates were presented, the narrative already forming into something clean and controlled. Temporary fluctuation. Self-correction. No long-term impact. The language was precise. Acceptable. Complete. She let it finish. Then she asked a different question. Who was closest to the system when it shifted? The room stilled slightly. It was not a question they had prepared for. "We do not have that level of detail," someone replied. Evelyn held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "Then we should," she said simply. The meeting moved on, but something had changed in the way she listened, in the spaces she paid attention to, in the people she did not overlook as easily anymore. Later that afternoon, she found herself walking through a corridor she had never taken before, lower than her usual path, quieter, less polished, the kind of place that existed to support everything above it without ever being seen. She slowed slightly, her heels softer against the floor, her eyes taking in details she would have once ignored. A man passed by with a toolbox, offering a small nod without stopping. She returned it, almost without thinking. For a brief second, their paths crossed. No introduction, no recognition, just a moment. Then it was gone. Marcus kept walking, his pace unchanged, his focus already on the next small thing that needed to be kept in place. Evelyn stood still for a fraction longer than necessary, then continued forward, something quiet settling into her expression, not a realization that needed to be spoken, but one that would shape what came next. Because sometimes the most important